crossing county lines just to make my name in the city. Took everything, put it on the line, cause I never break or back down. One shot is do or die, and the odds ain't looking too pretty. But I got the feeling it's my time. I know I'm taking it now.
Good morning and welcome to the Retirement Learning Lab, where we teach you how to retire without running out of money. My name is Van Richards, and I'd like to welcome you today. We're going to talk about the bucketing approach today to retirement income. Over the past couple of weeks, we've talked about every episode, we've talked about one of three of the most popular retirement income approaches. We talked about the systematic withdrawal approach. We've talked about the flooring income approach. And today we're finally going to talk about the bucketing approach to retirement income. I'd like to thank you if you're joining us on Tuesday morning live. And if you are, you have the opportunity to be a part of our live stream today. If you have questions and you want to ask them, jump right in there and type them in. If you're joining us on Facebook, Twitter, or on YouTube, you can do that. Now, if you're listening to this on a replay, go ahead and enter questions in if you have them, because I monitor the feed throughout the week. And if there's a question that comes across, I'll take the time to answer that for you. But if you're listening to me, especially on YouTube, go ahead and hit the subscribe button there, because every time that I have a new show that comes up, or else I have a new bit of information that I post to YouTube, you'll get a notification about that, and you'll be up to date as far as that goes. Now, the idea of the bucketing approach appeals to the kind of person that likes predictability in their life. If you like the idea of having a predictable income stream, about knowing that how everything's going to be laid out in future years, I really think that the idea of bucketing appeals to you, because you see what bucketing is. It's a systematic method of segmenting your life over the future. When you retire, you really have to come into the concept of how long am I going to need money for? A lot of people will use 30 years as a good example, because I think that if you retire at age 65, you'd think, okay, I think that maybe retiring at 65, I would live to be 90 or 95. Not everyone does that, but let's think that it's positive, and that's really what you want to do. You want the idea of a long, happy life. Unless you have a chronic illness or something like that, I don't think that you should plan on just having a 20-year retirement, because if you do, you might be sorely disappointed and really in financial problems when you get to be older, if you're in your 80s or 90s and you're having income trouble at that point in time. Plan on having a long life. Now, if you're retiring early, or if you have a family history of a long life, for example, I have friends that have family members that live into their 90s. In my family, I have different generations that have lived into their 90s. So if you're going to have that in the concept, then you might want to think about even longer, maybe 35 or 40 years. But you really need to try and peg some sort of number. The reason is we all know that we're not going to live forever. So if you know predictably how much you're going to need, then you can plan for it. Now, that's easier said than done. The way that the bucketing system works is it helps you to segment different stages of your life. Let's first take a look at a little bit more methodical description of what bucketing is. And remember, if you've got questions today, just type them in. We'll get a chance to answer those particular questions. If not today, then I'll be able to get to you. I'll answer back on the platform that you're watching, and perhaps even use it in a live stream show like this later on. Okay, so let's begin and just really look at how bucketing works. Okay, let me go back over that again just a little bit so that just in case you missed it. Bucketing, the concept is that what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to take advantage of the long-term economic cycles. Now, I used a big word in there for that you might hear in economics, which is called macroeconomics. That's the big picture. The big picture is that the economy goes through ebbs and flows. There's going to be expansion, there's going to be contraction. We're going to hit a bottom of the economy, which we may or may not be at in this particular recession. But recessions generally are going to last about 15 months. Expansions, or some people call it a bull market, might last about 15 years. So the idea of the 10-year bucket is so that it will be able to go through at least 1.5 to 2 full economic cycles. That takes a lot of the risk, a lot of the unpredictability out of using bucketing or out of saving for retirement or getting an income for retirement. I think that's probably a better way to say it from that standpoint. So you're able to be looking at a safer way of taking money out over a longer period of time. Now, when we look at the bucketing idea, the concept is that the buckets are designed to fit into people's life. And each bucket is designed based on a budget. As we look at each 10-year increment, we want to think of how much money that you're going to need at that particular point in time. Now, there's two approaches here that I want to blend together. And that is the idea that I've just mentioned about the economic cycles of at least about 9 to 10 years. And now I want to talk about what financial gerontologists use in talking about older age, as in what types of things are going to be happening in your life. Now, what I mean by that is you're going to go through stages in retirement where you're going to be more active or less active. That's going to be based on the fact that, well, you're human, and as you grow older, you will be less active. As you grow older, you will have ebbs and flows to your spending patterns. A lot of people, when they first retire, they think of, all right, I don't need as much money as I did when I was working, so I'm going to retire on 60 or 70% of what I was making. For some people, that works out. For some people, that's a mistake. If you don't keep control over how much money you're spending, it's possible that you could actually spend a lot more money than you were making in the first few years, because you've got a lot more time that's available to you. If you've got children, you can go visit them. If you like travel, you can go travel, and all those things cost money. And if you've got more time available, then you possibly could be spending more money. That's why having a budget is going to be a really, really important part of the idea of bucketing. Each 10-year bucket is going to have its own budget. And we're going to talk just a moment about how those budgets are laid out. But as we look through this, the idea is going to be that we want to think of when I mentioned a minute ago about the activity of life, and there are people in the world that are called financial gerontologists. These are people that study the finances of aging. And they've broken it up into really more 15-year increments. And actually, they've given it some interesting little names. Let's take a look at that. I think you'll find this appealing. Hopefully you do. The length of the bucket segments are related to the periods of your life. And as we age, we go through stages of our life. When you're in your 50s to 65, we call those the go-go years. Or you're young, old, you're active. When you hit middle old, that's ages 65 to 80. Those are the slow-go years. You slow down, and you spend less money here. Then you get to be 80 and older. Yeah, we call that old, and it's called the no-go years. You're not doing as much as you used to. Spending and expenses change through each stage of your life. Now, as I mentioned before, when you first retire, if you're looking at the go-go years, the years between age 50 and 65, you may be spending more money than you did when you retired. That's why what you want to do when you first get ready to retire, it's really important that you sit down and you create a budget. I've mentioned this before. If you're looking for a budgeting tool, there's really 3 of them that I like. One of them is my own personal one, which is on my website at richardsfinancialplanning.com. If you go down to the bottom and you look at the forms, you're going to find a multi-page form that I've created that's for budgeting. If you just want to write out things and keep an idea of how much money you're spending. I really like ynab.com. It's You Need a Budget. It does cost a little bit. I believe last time I looked, it cost about $7 a month. But it's a good system of helping you keep control over how much money that you spend. And then the third tool that a lot of people use is Mint, M-I-N-T. It's mint.com. And this is a good system, but it is free. That's a great thing about it. But the idea is that when you start using Mint, man, I got overwhelmed by the fact that it had the commercials for credit cards and for mortgages and a lot of different things. It's kind of like watching or listening to AM radio where you've got lots and lots of commercials in between every song, as opposed to listening to a live stream or a stream like XM or something like that, or even Spotify is only every 30 minutes. If you take the free version, you get commercials every 30 minutes, so you're not overwhelmed. But it's a good system. And you need to have a budget. There's just no way around that. If you don't have a budget, you're going to spend way too much money. And that's going to be one of the risks that we're going to talk about at the very end when we talk about all the different financial risks that you could possibly face when you get to retirement. Now, the next thing that we want to talk about, we've talked about the different stages. And if you notice there when I was talking about the financial gerontology descriptions, the go-go, the slow-go, and the no-go years, all of those are based on physical activity or health or mental wellness. As you get older, you're going to have more medical expenses. Now, when you first retire, I've mentioned this a couple of times when we've talked about budgets, you generally will have less expenses because if you've planned it properly, you should be spending about 80% of your income. Hopefully you don't have a mortgage. Maybe your car payment is less. You don't have as many expenses with children or with kids. You don't have as many extraneous expenses. So hopefully you're able to live on, let's say, 80 to 70% of your income. That's generally what I see as far as planning and budgeting for that first year of retirement. Now, let's go down the road 15 years and look at those slow-go years. Really, what happens in the slow-go years is most people end up dropping off as far as how much they're spending by about 20 to 25%. And that's a good thing because they're able to perhaps spend a little bit less money, perhaps even save a little bit more money. And that's really important because when you get to the no-go years, the age 80 and up, inevitably you're going to have more medical expenses and you need to be prepared for those. If you've had the forethought in past years to have an HSA or a health savings account, that's what that's going to be for. So you want to keep those long-term buckets, and an HSA can possibly be part of, or it certainly would be part of the third bucket if you use 3 buckets of the bucketing system. Now, when we get to the point of budgeting, I think that you need to understand that I know that when you look at how much money that you might be spending 20 years from now, that's going to be pretty much impossible to do because you don't know exactly what's going to be happening. But you can get a general idea. So if we take how much money that you're spending annually now, that'll probably be close to the same thing in 20 years. But of course, we must add in what? We have to add in inflation, the cost of goods. Remember how much a car payment was 20 years ago. How much will a car payment be 20 years from now? Same thing with your electric bill or your other utilities or even food expenses. That's a real biggie right there. Think about how much you paid for a loaf of bread 20 years ago. How much is it going to cost 20 years from now? probably twice as much. So you need to be able to keep up with it. Now, let's get to a little bit more of the idea of how that money is invested with bucketing. Bucketing gives you the comfort of saying, I don't need this money for 20 years, so I'm going to be able to put it away longer toward the future. Let's talk about how the buckets are invested. I think you'll find this very interesting. Each bucket has a specific allocation, and the risk of those buckets is determined by your preferences and your goals. Now, what I use the modern portfolio theory, and I've created 9 different models that use categories and investments from 12 different categories. When you combine the investment models and the investment categories, what you get is called a strategic asset allocation. That's the great big picture of how the money is going to be invested. Simply put, if you had 50% in stocks and 50% in bonds, that's a strategic asset allocation. The 9 models that I use are a little bit more complicated than that, and they use the modern portfolio theory, which is a methodical theory of managing risk through the economy. I have 9 different models that I utilize that uses 12 different categories of investments. And the categories are stocks, bonds, cash, excuse me, stocks, bonds, cash, commodities, futures, all the different types of things that are used, the different investment vehicles. And when you put all that together, you come up with hundreds and hundreds, perhaps even thousands of different combinations. Now, I don't go that far, but I'd say I probably have about 20 to 25 different models that are more common than others when we put that together. So what we do is we look at a bucket and we think, okay, for this first 10-year increment, we're going to invest that conservatively. And we want to be able to have the money so that there's not going to be a lot of risk to it. So that might be an ultra conservative investment. It may have bonds. It may have bond laddering in it. It may have annuities if you like annuities. It may have cash accounts. It may have CDs in it. It may have other guaranteed accounts that you might think of from an investment standpoint. We don't have as much stock in the 1 through 10-year time period unless it's going to be income producing. And the reason is you want to have more predictability in those first 10 years. Now, when we get to the second set of 10 years and the third set of 10 years, if we're using the 3-bucket system, those are going to be invested more aggressively. You might think of the middle years or the middle income years as being moderately aggressive. And then if you can tolerate the stock market and the investments, you might think of the years 20 through 30 as being more aggressive, where you may have as much as 80 or 90% of the investments that are put into stocks. Now, all of those different big percent allocations, remember, are called strategic asset allocations. As we go through time, though, we need to make microeconomic changes or small economic changes. And the small economic changes that we make to portfolios are called tactical asset allocation changes. That might be where we're looking at the travel industry and we're thinking, as of perhaps right now, travel industry is not a really good place to be invested. We've seen several companies that have gone bankrupt recently. So we don't want to be invested in that. So we'll remove that on a tactical asset allocation standpoint. But that's probably not going to change the overall picture of how we're managing the bucket. Remember, individual buckets for the bucketing system are managed through the concept of strategic asset allocations. Those strategic asset allocations will change as different things change in your life. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about there, because managing risk is not the only risk that you have to worry about as you go through retirement. Take a look at this with me. The buckets aren't a system where you just set it and forget it. You have to think of different strategic changes as risk comes at you. You do have the investment risk, which you have to manage over time. But you also, what happens if you have family dividends? That can affect your income. Government or political changes, wow, we're seeing that now. That can affect your income. If you spend too much money, you didn't have a good budget, that's a problem. If you didn't work long enough or you can't find work and you need to, that's a problem too. And of course, we're going to all face the sixth risk, which is the risk of getting older. And as life changes, we change the buckets too. So the concept is that you just don't take a bucket, a 10-year increment, and just say, okay, I'm not going to manage this thing until I'm not going to touch it again until I get to year 20 through 30. You have to be dynamic about how it's going to change. It's important that you look at it from a microeconomic change. And as we have tactical changes, small changes that are based on what's going on in the economy, not just things that we want to avoid. I mentioned the idea of tactical changes that might be because of investments that are not doing very well. But what about investments that are doing very well? What about companies that are taking advantage of the digital wave? I think that you need to look at adding those types of investments on a tactical asset allocation basis. However, still look at their strategic asset allocation, which is the great big picture. Their strategic asset allocation is based on the fact that, let's say, for example, if you have a allocation of small stocks, you still want to use small stocks when we're doing stock changes in the tactical asset allocation changes. If you're using, let's say, conservative bonds, you still want to use conservative bonds, even though you may be looking at a particular industry that might not be favorable and you want to get out of those bonds. Those are going to be more tactical asset allocation changes. So let's take a quick moment and just look at the what we've talked about today. Real quick, I'm just going to peer over at the comments and questions and see if we've had anything that's come through. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to save those for the very end. But what I want to do is I want to kind of recap what we've talked about today, and then let's say go on to next week and let you get on with your week. But the idea that we first began with is we talked about bucketing and how that bucketing is a system of segmenting your retirement income based on different budgets. That's the key point of the bucketing system. Some people think that bucketing is going to be one bucket is pouring into the other bucket. Well, that doesn't fit with the concept of bucketing the way that I'm describing it quite as much, because buckets are based on budgets for different periods of your life. Think about the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. That's how you're designing the buckets to take care of the budgets that are going to be created at those particular times. We've also talked about why the buckets are 10 years, so that it can take care of the different economic cycles that you might be experiencing. And then we've also talked about the fact that you have to have a budget. And the way that we create budgets is going to be based on the fact that you're looking at projections and forecasts of what you might be spending based on what you're spending right now. And then we wound things up today by talking about the different risks that you might be exposed to and how that you will manage your buckets based on the risk that you're facing in your life as time goes by. Okay. Now we take a few moments and we're going to answer a couple of different questions. I have a couple that had come through during the week and I wanted to take time to ask them or answer them. Marie from South Houston asked the question. She said, is now a good time to buy an annuity? Well, that's a good question, Marie. And the question is based on the fact that I assume the reason that you're asking that is because if you look at interest rates, they're really low right now. I don't foresee that interest rates are going to be going up in the near future. Actually, this past week when Fed Chairman Powell did an interview, he was very plain and to the point that the economic stimulus that's going on as far as like interest rates go probably aren't going to change for quite a long time. Now, the Federal Reserve is doing other things to stimulate the economy. Actually, yesterday, we saw that the Federal Reserve announced that they were going to be buying corporate bonds or buckets of corporate bonds to support the economy in that particular way. And that's been one of the reasons why, if you looked at the stock market today, which is June the 16th, if you looked at the stock market today around noontime, you'll see that the market is up quite a bit. And that's based on the news yesterday that the Fed was going to be buying corporate bonds. So let's answer your question. Is now a good time to buy an annuity? If you need a guaranteed stream of income and you like the idea of a guarantee, yes, now is still a good time to buy an annuity. The reason is, Marie, that the annuity is not just based on interest rates. It's based on the insurance company's profitability. Now, that insurance company might not just be selling annuities. They might be selling life insurance too. So they're getting income and profits from that as well. And when they look at all of their different profit streams as a business, they look at how much money that they can reasonably pay as far as an interest rate goes. Now, a lot of annuities, what they do is they look at your age, your health, and how long they're going out. So they're really going to be paying you part of your money back. And they're guaranteeing that if you live a certain number of years, they're going to pay you this certain number of income, this amount of income. Or that if you're taking a life income annuity, they may be paying it for the rest of your life. They're not going to lose. They have actuaries that have done studies, so they have an idea of how much money that they can pay out. But if you like the idea of a guaranteed income and a guaranteed stream of income, then yes, an annuity is a good deal still. I would be cautious from the standpoint and not buy annuities from low-rated insurance companies. And I'm going to say that again. I would do your research and avoid low-rated companies. If you have a particular company in mind, I've been in the insurance business for a long time, and I've been able to see what's available. If you want to shoot me a question off, just send me an email to van@richardsfinancialplanning.com, and I'll be glad to answer it. If you have an annuity that you're looking at, I'll be glad to see if I can give you my opinion on the financial stability of that particular annuity. I've written about annuities enough. I've been around long enough. I know what to look for. So that's a good question, Marie. Thank you for asking it so that I could answer it today. I have another one that I want to answer real quick, and it actually has to do with bucketing. And this comes from John, who's in Dallas. Thanks for watching the live stream, John. He says, can I use a target date fund for bucketing? Well, yes, you can. But you have to be cautious when you're using a target date fund for bucketing. Remember, what was the premise of bucketing? The premise of bucketing is you're designing your buckets based on budgets for future years, how much money you need. Well, if you want to put that amount of money into a target date fund that's based on a 20-year time frame, that would be a concept that might work. The big caution that I want to warn you about when it comes to target date funds is target date funds, they have to manage. We're talking about a mutual fund here. And a mutual fund, remember, has a professional portfolio manager, and they're going to manage a group of bonds or stocks, whatever the case might be. And with a target date fund, they're going to look at a time period, let's say 20 years from now. And let's say that they're looking at the year 2040 as a target date. And they're thinking that what I'm going to do is I'm going to manage this aggressively now because I've got about 20 years before I am going to have to pay this out to customers, or before customers are going to want to use the money. So as time goes by, they have what's called a glide path. And the glide path goes from aggressive to conservative over a period of time. And that's really part of what we do for a bucket. We've talked a little bit about the different modern portfolio theory, the allocation models that I mentioned previously, in a target date fund, they're going to narrow down toward that particular year as we do in the portfolios that we manage here. And we're going to get more and more conservative as it goes by. But let me get to my point. My point is that if you are looking for a target date fund, be cautious of the fact that they are managing it in the way that you think that they are. And what I mean by that is, if you think, let's say, for example, that we have a target date fund that's 2025, you would think that that's going to be a conservative investment, but it might not. There's not a standard allocation or a standard description of a 2025 target date fund. It may have quite a bit more stocks in it than it does bonds, and they may be taking quite a bit more risk than what you want. You have to be cautious of that, especially over the long term, because things change. There was a company that I used a couple of years back that was called the Russell Funds. And Russell actually, for their retirement accounts, they decided, well, we're going to stop offering target date funds to retirement accounts. And actually, they backtracked and changed since then. But you need to keep on top of that, because sometimes they'll make changes and you don't know about it. You can't just set it and you forget it. Also, target date funds aren't sensitive to the 6 different risks that I talked about previously. You have to be also cautious of the fact of, when you're working with target date funds, they can have multiple layers of fees that are associated with it. A lot of the target date funds, what they do is, let's say, for example, I think that the Fidelity Freedom Funds do this, and there's quite a few other different funds that do this too. Their target date funds are funds of funds. So you have one mutual fund that has one set of fees, and then those fees are basically lumped in with the target date fund that has its own set of fees. So be cautious of how that you are using target date funds, because some of them, I'm not saying Fidelity in particular, I'm not saying to buy or sell Fidelity, but I'm saying that some particular funds can have higher target date fund fees than others. So be very cautious of that if you're going to use a target date fund. Now, what I do for people is I design, just as a shout out for myself as I end today, I do the analysis of their particular situation and do a methodical financial plan that will help them look at the budgets that they're going to have for different time periods and how much money they're going to need for different stages of their life. Then we set aside money for those stages. And actually we will have, if we're using the 3-bucket system, we will actually have 3, perhaps 4 different buckets, because I think the idea of cash as a separate bucket is a really pretty good idea. I didn't talk about this very much before, but I think that recommending that people have about maybe a 15 to 24 month long amount of cash is a good idea. And the reason is the average recession lasts about 15 months. The recession we're going through right now probably won't be that long, but the average recession is about 15 months. So if you've got 15 months worth of cash, then you're not going to have to worry about having to sell stocks or bonds in a down market. So that's the idea of how we work with that. Okay, that comes to end of the question and answer time period. Hopefully I got there quicker than it felt like, but if you have questions throughout the week and you want to ask them, feel free to enter them in on the different platform. Hey, if you're joining on YouTube, go over and hit the subscribe button and you'll get notified of when the next live broadcast is going to be. Until next week, or until you see another one of my videos that drops on the YouTube channel, have a great week.